Welcome and thank you for joining us today. Thank you for making the way through the Oslo sloppy weather. Tonight we'll be discussing human rights situation in Iran, and tomorrow it happens to be on the same day as International Human Rights Day, which is the same occasion as Narges Mohammadi's award ceremony. My name is Sevda. I'm a journalist at Avisa Oslo. And together with the Vikanar from Human Rights Fund, will be moderators of the event. We have 3 participants with us today, and they will first give up to 10-minute speeches each, and then will be followed by a panel discussion. The panelists in order are Mahmood Amiry-Moghaddam. He's a professor at the University of Oslo and founder of Iran Human Rights. We also have with us Olive Moore, who is the interim director of the organization Frontline Defenders. And we'll also have Hannah Neumann, who is the member of the European Parliament with us today. The discussion will focus on the challenges faced by the activists in Iran, the implication for the broader human rights landscape, and the international community's role in advocating for protection of defenders. Hopefully we have time for all. We'll open for questions at the end from the audience, and the panel will end at 7 o'clock. First, I'll ask Mahmood Amiry-Moghaddam to come up. He will share with us Iran Human Rights Report on the human rights defenders in 2023 in Iran, and provide some highlights on the situation of Iranian human rights. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Sevda, and good evening to everyone. Today is, well, right now, it's the eve of the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights when it was ratified at the UN, and 25th anniversary of the Declaration of the Human Rights Defenders. So it's a very important day. And it becomes even more important if we look at what's happening in addition to this anniversary, that tomorrow we have the ceremony of the Nobel Peace Prize to Narges Mohammadi, who is one of the human rights defenders, one of the more than 150 human rights defenders who have been profiled in the report of Iran Human Rights. So this evening or tonight we publish a report on situation of the Iranian human rights defenders from the 1st of December 2022 to 1st of December 2023, in 1 year. And during this time, you know that we have had the Women Life Freedom protests and all the arrests that has happened after that. This report profiles, as I mentioned, 150 defenders who either have been in prison in this time period or have an active charge against them. So it means that many, probably thousands of human rights defenders who are not in prison or sentenced or have official charges, but have been harassed, they have been forced to leave their countries, they have been threatened, none of them are mentioned in this report. And this report, of course, does not include all human rights defenders who are in prison based on our definition of human rights defender, a person who fights or works for the human rights, his, her own rights or other people's rights by peaceful means. And there are a lot of them, and we don't have information about all of them, but some of them have been profiled here. And these 250 are together, collectively, sentenced to 541 years in prison and 577 lashes. They include civil activists, lawyers, teachers, workers, artists, women rights defenders, environmentalists, and many more. I invite you to read this report that will be on our website from this evening and will be disseminated broadly from tomorrow. But I would like to draw attention to one of the groups, the lawyers. Several of the lawyers that have been profiled in this or have been featured in this report, they are lawyers who, many of them pro bono, defended protesters of the Women Life Freedom protests, like Mariam Arvin, a young lawyer who was helping a lot of protesters, defending them, giving them counsel. She was arrested, and a short time, few weeks after she was released, she committed suicide, some people say, but she died under suspicious circumstances. She was completely healthy. Nobody knows what happened to her under the detention. Her mother has talked about that she received intravenous injections of some drugs. We don't know. But she is one of the defenders that we have profiled, along with these two young lawyers, Amir Hossein Kuhkan and Amiry-Moghaddam, both of them being arrested because of defending protesters of Women Life Freedom protests. Amir Hossein has been incommunicado since he was arrested in August, so we don't know so much about him. So I invite you to read this report. The reason why we publish this is because we think that on one side, when the world sees what is going on in Iran, the gross human rights violations, I think they should also see the faces of some of the brave people who are fighting for the human rights. And, of course, we want the international community to support Iranian human rights defenders. They are fighting for our common values, and they are taking a very heavy risk. So we hope that awarding of the Nobel Peace Prize to Narges Mohammadi not only will amplify her voice, but will also put a spotlight on all the brave Iranian human rights defenders who are fighting for fundamental rights. So at the end of this report, we have some recommendations. We can talk more about it, what the international community can do. But one of our main demands is that situation of human rights defenders must be on the agenda in any bilateral or multilateral talks between any country and the Islamic Republic of Iran. International community must put pressure on the Islamic Republic to set free unconditionally and immediately all imprisoned human rights defenders. And we want those responsible for the atrocities to be held accountable. And I hope that also the civil society and all people listening to me now, they look at the faces, at the names, remember their names, and represent these human rights defenders. They need our attention, and I think we all together can make a difference. We can continue their way. We can help them to bring human rights to Iran. So I stop here, and we can continue the discussions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mahmood. I would like to invite Olive Moore now, Interim Director of Frontline Defenders, who will speak about the general situation of human rights defenders and particularly the situation of human rights defenders in Iran post the 2022 protests.
Good evening. Firstly, Mahmood, Iran Human Rights, thank you very much for the invitation to be here tonight and to be here tonight in Oslo. It's such an important weekend, and it's really nice to be here with so many people from the international human rights community who are here as well to celebrate and to recognize the work of Narges, a phenomenal Iranian human rights defender, but many, many other Iranian human rights defenders, women human rights defenders, men human rights defenders, all of those defenders today. Higher? Okay. So maybe before I say a few words, the first thing I suppose that I wanted to recognize is that we're coming together tonight and this weekend in what is a moment of, I think, intense trauma for us within the international human rights community globally, and a huge amount of disappointment. I don't think disappointment as a word even covers what we're all feeling and the questions that we're all asking ourselves around the universality of human rights today. And many of this is happening within the region and happening so close, and is something I know that even the Iranian human rights defenders that we work with are watching and feeling and advocating on themselves as well. And certainly what's happening within Gaza and the permission that some international community actors have granted for this to happen, and the lack of a willingness to step up and to speak out and to address that is something that's really, really challenging for the whole region, but not just for the whole region, for the world. And I think this brings huge questions around our whole international human rights system. And one of the most basic principles that our international human rights system, Mahmood talked about the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the 25th anniversary of the Declaration on Human Rights Defenders, which are based on the principle of universality. The most simple and profound idea that all human rights apply equally to everyone. And I think what we're seeing is a human rights system that had cracks and flaws that we all understood was broken and didn't function in the way that we needed it to, or it needed to, but has now very much been cracked right open. And certainly what we're hearing from defenders around the world is that there are very fundamental questions around how our human rights system and the role of human rights defenders who are watching and questioning and watching very closely what all international governments, what us, international civil society, are doing and how we're responding. And I suppose it's just for me that we don't speak here just about one country. This is a global, this is a regional issue, this is a global issue. And what we've seen over the last few years is a significant shift and a change in the situation for human rights defenders globally. Within Frontline Defenders, we're part of the Human Rights Defender Memorial, which tracks the killings of human rights defenders globally. So human rights defenders around the world who are killed, who are targeted and killed because of their human rights work. And each year on year, we have seen the number of human rights defenders that have been killed rise. And these are only the defenders that we can track, and we have evidence and we have stories that we can speak to. The role of the memorial is a little bit like the Nobel Peace Prize, to recognize, to memorialize, to speak of these individual human rights defenders who've paid the ultimate price. But it's also about accountability. It's also about us tracking and understanding what's happening. And what we're seeing with the killing of human rights defenders is something that echoed. We're seeing trends in so many different countries that concern all of us. A shift to the right, the rise of authoritarianism, this permissive state internationally which is facilitating and allowing repressive regimes to target human rights defenders. Some of our most fundamental basic human rights around freedom of expression, freedom of association, freedom of assembly are being pulled back on, are being challenged, and are being taken apart in so many different countries. And those who are at the forefront of this, including in Iran, human rights defenders who are challenging this are paying the price for that. And what we're seeing is all of the playbook that we've seen before, the criminalization, arbitrary detention, prison sentences, torture, violence, assault, all of this and much, much more. Very complex defamation campaigns against human rights defenders, high level of surveillance against human rights defenders. And these are playing out globally, playing out regionally, and playing out within Iran as well. And I suppose being here for the Nobel Peace Prize gives us a moment to step back to recognize, to reflect. And I really welcome the Nobel Peace Prize really recognizing the role of human rights defenders. The Sunflower Declaration said, there's no peace without human rights, and there's no human rights without human rights defenders. And that is absolutely true. And that importance of our recognition around that is hugely important. And the importance of what Narges has done, all of the work that she's worked on for human rights, and what this will bring her and women human rights defenders, many women human rights defenders jailed, the power that this brings is hugely important. But at the same time, Narges isn't here today. And that challenge of us continuing to talk about, to celebrate, to speak about defenders who are imprisoned, particularly what's happening in Iran around very long prison terms, around continuous new allegations brought against defenders, around defenders being released and then re-imprisoned very, very quickly. That particular really, really devastating trend that we're seeing around closing down voices and spaces. Iranian human rights defenders have worked for many, many years. Of course, globally, we see more in the news over the last year or two, but there's nothing new here to this campaign, to this work that has been happening. And what we're seeing with human rights defenders is across so many different areas. Of course, women human rights defenders at the forefront, who are really speaking out for women's human rights, for equality there, but many others, labour, trade unionists, teachers, professionals now, more and more being targeted for the work that they're doing. Those who are working on anti-death penalty, those who are working on all of these particular torture, inhumane conditions within prisons, all being targeted because of the work that they're doing, and targeted with long prison sentences, and targeting of their family and their family members as well, and those around them, in order to try and silence them. There is so much that we can and need to continue to do. Mahmood, as you called, the release of all human rights defenders in Iran, accountability for crimes against human rights defenders, accountability for the killings of human rights defenders that we've seen in the last number of years. But really importantly for us, the voices of human rights defenders, that the voices of human rights defenders are prioritised from Iran, are heard, and are heard in the spaces and the places where decisions are made, which then shifts to the role of the international community, which we talked about earlier already, all of the actions that can be taken, actions that are bilateral, talks, conversations, demands, all of these trade negotiations, all of these spaces that negotiations are happening, where the voice of human rights defenders need to be heard and need to be listened to. Really just to say, the work of Narges, the work of so many women human rights defenders is an inspiration to so many of us, and it keeps us doing what we do. And I know that human rights defenders around the world are watching and are seeing this, and even we've been speaking to many over the last few weeks who are seeing the recognition as such an important part. So for me, that recognition, that high-level acknowledgement of the legitimacy and the importance of the work that they're doing, and that we stand behind that. So, thank you.
Thank you, Olive Moore. I'll invite Hannah Neumann to the stage, who will be talking about supporting human rights defender in Iran, in transit, and in Europe.
Good afternoon. It's good to be in Oslo again. It's especially nice to speak here after such amazing two speakers who represent such two very important organizations that shed light on what the regime wants to hide, which is the work of human rights defenders, their mission, their bravery, and support them wherever they can. Whenever I need numbers on what is happening in Iran, Mahmood, I go to your organization, Iran Human Rights, to get the information. Whenever I have a human rights defender that needs help, I go to your organization, Frontline Defenders and Protect Defenders, and see what we can organize as a support network. So speaking after the two of you here in Oslo on the eve of the award of the Nobel Peace Prize to Narges Mohammadi is also for me a very special moment. What I learned since I work with Iranians is there's always a surprise. So what I was told is there will be 3 chairs and we will have a panel discussion with a few people in the university. What I got when I was here was an Iran international live streaming. So I made up 3 sheets so that I'm a bit prepared. But as we stand here and the Nobel Peace Prize will be awarded tomorrow, it will be awarded to Narges Mohammadi, but I think it will be also awarded to every Iranian that stands up against this brutal regime, is to recognize what, especially Iranians, people inside Iran, but also Iranians all over the world, achieved in the last 1.5 years. And this is that you can wake up every child in this world and they know how brutal the Iranian regime is. 2 years ago, that was known to foreign policy experts such as me, or human rights activists. But what really was achieved in the last 1.5 years is that everyone knows this regime is brutal, this regime needs to go away, and Iranians are ready to kick it out. And no one will ever be able to take that away from you. I think what it needs now to move to the next step is to formulate an alternative vision for Iran, for a free Iran, and to build alliances. That's the role of Iranians. That's not my job. But what I think is our job as the international community, as the human rights movement, as foreign policy people, is to make sure that we stop, intentionally or unintentionally, stabilizing a regime while people in Iran are willing to die for its downfall. And this sadly still happens. And I have to admit, I'm sometimes a bit tired of repeating the same demands all over again. Let's name this regime what it is, a terror organization, terrorizing its own people, terrorizing a whole region. Hamas has killed with weapons from Iran. Hezbollah is supported by this regime. This regime sends weapons to Russia to fight Ukraine. This regime puts Iraq into a difficult situation. This regime puts Syria into a difficult situation. Many people have died, also outside Iran. So it's not just about Iran. And let's just continue to name it what it is, a terror regime, and put it on the terror list. That has been said quite often, but I still have the impression I need to repeat it because we are not there yet. Let's also be open and name what this regime does to its own people, and that's why your work is so important, portraying what it does to human rights defenders, the people that fight for human rights of Iranians, that protect Iranians from its own regime. That's quite weird, right? But they are doing that. And they are put into prison for it, they are killed for it, they're harassed for it, and not them, but their families and everyone who tries to support them. Because the regime is always saying it's not that bad, we are not really doing that. It's like a strategy of gaslighting, and that's why it is so important that others say, but we see what is happening. We also see that this regime uses sexual violence as a tool of intimidation. We have seen them shooting in the faces and the genitals of young women protesting. We know that they use rape as a strategy of intimidation and as a strategy to get forced confessions out of people. This is what the regime does, and we have to continue to say that, and to say that we see it. And I think it is also our job to support and protect those who defend human rights in Iran wherever we can. There are some things that, no, let me start in another way. We should not overestimate, and please don't overestimate what can be done from the outside. This regime needs to be brought down from Iranians in Iran, and we can only do so much to support. But the little we can do, we have to do it with full force. Internet and communication technologies. The regime has channels to send its propaganda all over the world. They are so professional that we saw in some stages even very established media just took regime propaganda for granted and published it like they would be abolishing the Revolutionary Guards. That news was all over. We have to make sure that human rights defenders, that civilian journalists, that bloggers from inside Iran are able to also share their information, disseminate what is really happening inside Iran without limitations and without fear of being harassed afterwards, and even if the regime shuts down the internet. There are technical things we can do, and we have to make sure we really support with everything we have. Finance. The regime has enough channels to get money inside the country, even with the sanctions in place. Those who want to help their family members with the bailout, those who want to help family members that lost their job because they dare to speak up, they find it very difficult to send money home. That's a disbalance that we need to see how we can overcome it. Access to the fact-finding mission of the United Nations. I just told you how important it is that these facts are being put on paper as facts, that they become UN reports and other reports. The fact-finding mission finds it difficult to have access to Iran itself. There's little we can do, but we can support when people need to travel outside of Iran so they can make their statements. We can support if people are intimidated because they made their statements online, for example, so that we ensure that they can do their work as good as possible. We can give more visa to human rights defenders, to protesters that have lost their eye, that need urgent medical care. I know some countries are doing something, but we can do more, and we know it. And then, and you said it very well in your slides, just speak about it. We know that this regime kills and makes people disappear when they think they can get away with it. Since the war started in Gaza, they killed more than 100, they executed more than 150 people. Some of them minors, some of them part of the peaceful protesters in 2019. So the moment they think the world looks away, they try to, what they call clean up. So we should never ever look away. What can we do to people in transit? Because we have Iranians that, even if we give them a visa, that's what happened to the family of Gina Mahsa Amini yesterday, they are blocked from exiting. We have people that come out of political prison, they are under travel ban. We have people that don't have passports and that for good reasons don't want to get passports. But they managed to go to Turkey, they managed to go to Iraq. We have to make sure that either they feel safe in these countries and we put pressure on the governments of these countries so they are really safe, or we help them getting visa from these countries, even though they are illegally in these countries. And there are ways to solve it. We all know it. So this is another issue. And always make sure that we don't just think of the human rights defender as a person, but of the family, because the regime doesn't target the human rights defender as a person. They deliberately go for the mother, the father, the sister, the brother, or the children. And I can tell you as a mother, that's the worst. If you decide for your activism to make it into shitstorms, to be blocked from entering certain countries, even to be put in prison, that's a decision you make for yourself. But they go after your children. And your children never ever made this decision. And it's such a toxic, brutal, inhumane way. But we need to step up our protection infrastructure to protect the family as a whole. And then sadly, even if these human rights defenders come to the European Union, not everything is solved, and we know it. There are transnational threats. It's a nice term. Basically, it means the regime goes after them even when they're here. They often have problems with their visa status to either they have to stay in the refugee homes and wait until their asylum is processed, which is very difficult, for example, if you need medical treatment, if you are fragile, which most people are after what happens. When you actually need to be in your own flat or with your family, but you have to stay in these homes and wait for this whole process. Or if they get the other visa category, they are free to go wherever, but they don't have any social or health care, which is also a problem, especially if you're fragile, especially if you have wounds or other problems, or if you need to see a psychologist. So we really need to see that our system doesn't fit the needs of the people that come here, although we want them to come here. So there really is a problem that we also need to fix. And I think we should also help these people to continue their political work when they are here. Because that's what why they had to leave. That's what we need them to do. And that's what they want to do. But it is difficult if you are all of a sudden in a different country where you don't even speak the language. So there are still things we can do and where we have to become better. To conclude, let me say I'm very glad that Narges will be given the Nobel Peace Prize tomorrow. I'm very glad that the Sakharov Prize of the European Parliament will go to Jina Mahsa Amini and the Women Life Freedom Movement. These prizes are important because the regime kills when the attention fades, and these prizes help to keep up the attention. But these prizes also recognize the struggle of all those inside Iran who put up with the regime. But frankly said, I don't feel like celebrating because we are giving prizes to people that are in prison, to people that are dead. I would rather like to see us next year celebrate all together in Tehran, a free Iran.
Thank you, Hannah. We'll be just rearranging with some chairs and we'll continue the discussion. Mahmood, maybe you can start with defining who you define as a human rights defenders in your report.
Yes, that's a very good question because, we define anyone who fights for the human rights, either his, her own rights or other people's rights, as a human rights defender. So that's the simple answer, but it is challenging. Some people don't want to be defined as human rights defenders. You can think that in a context like Iran, when basically anyone fighting to change this system, the change of the system will lead probably to an improvement in the human rights. So our main challenge has been one to identify, because before it used to be that only known activists were defined as human rights defenders. So let's say a worker who was protesting or demanding rights for himself or his colleagues never received that kind of attention. Or someone who demands right to speak in his or her mother tongue never was defined. You needed to be important, well-known, maybe a lawyer, but that has changed, and that's what we are trying to change, that basically anyone. So the challenge is to identify them. It's more difficult to identify those who are in the marginalized parts of the country, who do not have the same networks, but we do our best. So that's why I say that the number of human rights defenders who need our attention is much, much higher than what we have managed to feature here.
Right. And you also said that we need to hold the Islamic Republic accountable. Which instances do we have in the international community to do just that?
I think international community must develop a better system to hold perpetrators accountable, because we are not so good at it. So the few mechanisms that can be used against Iranian authorities right now, I think the best one is this UN fact-finding mission that eventually might lead to holding them accountable. But then, in our world, we have the Security Council that has a lot of power. If you want to take someone to the Hague, so I think it's. I think we need to make profound changes in the international mechanisms.
What kind of changes?
So that leaders in countries can be held accountable. Right now, it is almost impossible unless you are a completely useless leader that none of the big powers care about you. Otherwise, it is not possible. We have very few examples, of course, in Yugoslavia and also in Sudan. I think there are examples where, like, leaders, at least the international community, try to hold them accountable, but otherwise it's very difficult. I think that we need to push for better mechanism, but I'm sure that Hanna Neumann has much better ideas.
We'll come back to that question at the end. We'll get more. But before we move on, can you just tell us how you worked with the report? What methods did you use?
Yes. So as I said, I mean, we have been trying to identify, let's say, less known defenders, and that has been very challenging because of obvious reasons. Communication with human rights organizations, it's a crime according to the Islamic Republic. So sending information to us, it's very risky, but still people do so. So those who are included in this report are either people that we have who have given consent and we have managed to communicate with directly or indirectly, or through the families, through someone who knows them, or their information has been publicly available and they fall into the definition. So there are also people who have asked not to be included in the report, whom we would define as human rights defenders. And so I think the most important challenge has been to get access to information to people, and the fact that people are, many people feel it's too risky. So so that's how we have, and then trying to access the court documents. You have someone in the prison, and then that it's a human rights defender, but then to find out what has exactly happened, it's very difficult. Some of them, their lawyers are arrested as well, because normally lawyers would be a source of information. And the lawyer I showed, one of the two young men, his client was the father of one of those who was executed, was arrested, and the lawyer was arrested. So there is so it's very challenging.
Okay, thank you, Mahmood. We can move on to Olive. Olive, you spoke about the general situation of human rights and human rights defenders globally and in Iran. So maybe we can start first with the question on how does frontline defenders define human rights defenders, and especially in a context like Iran?
Yeah. So, as Mahmood was saying, we have the Declaration of Human Rights Defenders, which speaks about anyone who works for human rights. But also for me and for us, a huge part is working on behalf of others. So when you're working and advocating on behalf of human rights for communities, for others, for families, for many different groups. And I think the other very important part of it is working non-violently. So someone who does not advocate violence and works towards peace are huge. So there are, I hope, millions of human rights defenders around the world. Many in the room today, many who are watching. Even this group here would be human rights defenders for me. Anyone who's speaking out, who's working on behalf of others, who's trying to promote respect, protection for human rights. For ourselves, as frontline defenders, we work with human rights defenders at risk, which is a different thing. These are those human rights defenders that face persecution, because of the work that they do. So because you are a human rights defender, because you choose to stand up, to speak out, to challenge, you then face all of these different reprisals, risks, threats because of that work. So for us, certainly in our work, it's not just about the human rights defender, but it's actually, well, what are the risks and who are those who are at the highest level of risk? And like Mahmood is saying, there are many defenders at risk, but often who are those who are most vulnerable, who are most marginalised, who doesn't have anyone else to speak up on their behalf, who are isolated, who the very different parts of intersectionality, whether it's women human rights defenders, defenders with disabilities, whether it's ethnic minority groups, again, all of these groups who, again, particularly may, because of their profile and who they are, have additional risk that they face because of the work that they do. So again, it's always about really trying to understand for at least who's most at risk and who do we support and how do we reach those defenders. And often those who are most at risk are the ones that are least seen, which comes very much back to Hannah's point around visibility. So those defenders that are most at risk are the ones that don't always have the highest profile. Of course, high-profile defenders have risk, but the defenders we worry about are the ones that we don't know about, the ones that are working quietly in villages and towns, in rural areas, defenders who aren't necessarily the lawyers, the ones who might have access and understand legal instruments or access to mechanisms, defenders who don't even see themselves as defenders, the doctors, who are just doing their work as a doctor and then find themselves in a situation that they're documenting horrendous human rights violations and crimes through those who end up in the hospitals. And suddenly they're a human rights defender without knowing, wanting, or understanding what that is. The teachers, who simply stand up and speak out for the children in their classroom because they're seeing what's happening and they say, no, this is something I want to speak on. And again, they're a human rights defender in those contexts.
Thank you, and I'll follow up on that point on visibility too. And Hannah and you both spoke a bit about the international community and how we can work, particularly on protection of human rights defenders in Iran. So, yeah, could you expand a little more, or if you want to add a bit more on both protection agencies like yourself, organizations working on protection, as well as the international community, and how we can increase the visibility of.
So visibility is an immensely powerful tool for human rights defender protection, but not always. And a huge part of that is those who know and understand when visibility is an asset and it's something that they wish are human rights defenders themselves. In other cases, visibility brings additional risk. So a huge part of that is understanding what you spoke to there around consent and around ideas around, is this something that's going to be of benefit and of use, and how will we use that? I was struck a little bit even on visibility when you started to talk about accountability. When we talk about accountability, we really often jump to the highest levels of accountability, which is right. We think of security councils and international tribunals and courts. For me, one of the most simple and important points of accountability is actually the very first step, which is a visibility of recognizing. Many of our defenders that we work with will never get close to a court. When we look at the killings of human rights defenders globally, it's in the single digits, the amount of those that actually result in court cases or convictions around an accountability around who did it. Mm-hmm. In many of those cases, the governments, including what you spoke about in Iran, do not want us to know. They do not want these people to be named. They do not want this crime to be made public. They do not want it to be available or accessible. So for me, the first and most important part of accountability is naming what happened, is bringing visibility, if that's what a human rights defender wishes for, is actually saying, this happened and this is wrong. It seems very small and it seems quite futile, but in so many cases we don't even get that far, or for defenders don't even get that far. So the first part of accountability is visibility, is calling out what happened. And then you move on to all of the different ways that we need to hold account, which includes international tribunals and all of those different spaces. But maybe I thought Hannah spoke well on visibility as well as being something that can be very powerful and very useful, because it says we know what's happening, we're watching, and this has not gone unseen.
And let's continue that thread of visibility. Hannah, you said that the Islamic Republic should be on the terror list. Why aren't they on the terror list, and what happens if they actually come or become on the terror list?
Well, that's two questions. I start with the first one. Why are they not? This has two dimensions. The first one is a legal debate. because there are certain criteria in the European texts that need to be fulfilled for a certain organization to be put on the terror list. And there are at the moment there are some scholars and some politicians who say everything is fulfilled, we can put them on the terror list, and others who say not everything is fulfilled, so better be careful, because nothing worse than putting them on the terror list. Then someone goes to court and then they need to be removed again, because that would be like sending the signal they are not terrorists, which they clearly are. But I think rather than the legal battle, we at the moment have a political battle, and that's played out on the legal field because no one wants to say we don't dare putting them on the list. And to put an organization on the terror list in the European Union, all 27 member states need to agree. We know that there are some member states that really push hard. The Netherlands, Germany are the ones I know where also the parliament is, for example, in favor. Also the European Parliament pushes hard. But we have seen, for example, last year when there was the anniversary of the so-called Islamic Revolution, that there were even the ambassadors of Hungary and I think another EU country shaking hands with Raisi. So there are some countries who are very reluctant to put them on the terror list, and this is why we are stuck. If you ask me what would be different, frankly said, I think it would be a very strong signal and a symbol, because it clearly says we think you are terrorists, which to my understanding means you would also have to stop meeting with them on red carpets and shaking their hands, which we still see and which drives me very crazy that this still happens. But on substance, it wouldn't change so much because the IRGC is already listed in a similar sanction regime because of the supply it gave in Syria and to the chemical weapon system. So they are already listed, but not with a symbol saying you are a terror organization. And symbols, we know it, are very important. That's also why IRGC is fighting so hard and throwing around all these threats, what they would do if they would end up on the terror list.
Thank you. I see we're running out of time, so I'll just ask the audience, is there any questions someone wants to ask? If not, we'll continue asking more. Anyone? No? Okay. Do we need a mic or? Okay. Hold on.
First of all, thank you. It's good. Thank you so much, Mahmood, for your excellent work, and everybody has seen your work over the past year and a half, and how you have been very impactful in providing timely information. I think it's very much needed. My question is about the first item on the list of recommendations, on whether basically putting the human rights, including the human rights agenda in any bilateral or multilateral conversation with Iranians, with the Iranian government, or I think it was conversation in any interactions they have. So there are two schools of thought on this. One is what you have mentioned in your report, that to put pressure on the Iranian government, we need to include human rights in any negotiations because it's going to be costly for the Iranian government. It's going to increase the pressure enormously, and that's how we should pursue this. The second school of thought says that to include human rights in negotiations that are not about human rights, it's very risky because, for example, when you're negotiating on Iran's nuclear program, and the framework of the nuclear program is international security. And if the international community, like if the European countries and the US, for example, if Iran give what they want when it comes to the nuclear program, they would definitely sideline that human rights aspect. And I understand there are pros and cons to both of them. My question is, to all of you, first with Mahmood, how did you come up with this one and pick this one strategy, and what are the pros to this strategy at this particular moment, because we are in the post-Mahsa Amini era, and it's a very different time. I would like to hear your opinion on that, and I would like to hear Hannah and also Olive's opinion on this based on your experience, what it means to include human rights in negotiations that might not have, might not be related to human rights. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your kind comments and very important question. Honestly, I believe that international community shouldn't talk about anything else than situation of Iranian people with the Iranian regime. That should be the only subject, because that's what matters for Iranian people. I don't think that I don't think that it's only the right thing to do, but also the wise thing for the international community. I think that any other agreement that you reach with the Islamic Republic on anything else would, in the best case, be a temporary deal, like a nuclear deal. You might be able to reach an agreement, and then the moment it's not useful for the Islamic Republic or the other part, the deal is broken. So if we think long term, and unfortunately I think that's where the foreign policy is not long term, all countries, governments try to solve the short term crisis all the time without thinking what is the consequences in 10, 15 years. We all know that all the aggressors who start invading other countries, they started invading their own people's human rights first. But at that time, international community didn't react. So they start reacting when it's too late. So I think that a democratic Iran that respects its own people's rights, I don't think they would need a nuclear program, and I don't think they will pose a threat to neighboring countries. But from our side, I think that Iranian people should be on top of the agenda. We write the same also on our recommendations in our death penalty report, that they should not be talking about anything else than, and the same was in South Africa, during apartheid. The apartheid regime in South Africa, they had a disputed nuclear program. And I don't think when the South African government traveled around countries talked about the nuclear issue, the issue was the apartheid. Once the apartheid was removed, the nuclear program was not relevant anymore. And I think that's the same with Iran.
We're out of time, so unless you guys disagree completely, let's move on to another question.
I wouldn't disagree, but I would like to compliment. Because we think a lot about what should we say or should we not say when we sit with the Iranian regime. And I understand that there are certain things that will always need to be discussed with those who formally hold the power in a country, which is sadly at the moment the Iranian regime. But we should not fall into the trap of accepting what they want us to believe, which is that they represent the country. So while we still have to talk with them on certain issues, we should make sure that we at the same time meet and talk to other people, to other groups that represent other people and other groups, I would say the majority of people in Iran, and discuss all these issues about security, about human rights, about the economic situation with them as well. To just stop playing the game of the regime that claims to have legitimacy to speak for Iran, which they don't have anymore.
Very quickly.
And I would just say, I can't think of any issue where I don't think it's relevant to talk about human rights. I'm thinking of sport, I'm thinking of entertainment, I'm thinking of across the board. I think there's a question as to whether it's strategic, which is a different conversation. And that, for me, will always be led by human rights defenders who say, well, is it strategic and useful in this space to speak about this or not? But often, actually, it's that point that it's often deeply political. So when someone is saying to you, this isn't strategic, I wouldn't always believe that, because I think actually that might be a political rather than a strategy issue around that. So,
is there any other questions?
Thank you very much, dear Mahmood, for organizing this. Is it okay?
Yeah.
Yes. And thank you, dear panelists here. It was quite of a learning panel, I must say. Thank you. I'm a member of Baha'i community. And again, I cannot sleep well tonight if I don't bring this up. Because right now, and we all know today, Mr. Rahmani, the husband of Narges Mohammadi, announced, actually in one of his first statement, he mentioned the situation of Baha'is in Iran. I don't know what's my question, but right now, Mahvash Sabet is on hunger strike. She's 69, and she has, in her CV, she has 10 years of imprisonment in Iran. Harsh interrogations, I mean by breaking her knees and her hips. And Narges Mohammadi has, in support of her, also joined her in... and you know, in Norwegian media, my husband, who is a Norwegian, reads... Mr. Rahmani has mentioned religious minority. Which religious minority? Why are we so scared to mention the name Baha'i? Why? Isn't it time to realize that this history has repeated itself? And we have been afraid of mentioning certain religions, and we still are sometimes. So my question to you guys is, how can we raise awareness that this is an identity for a minimum population of 300,000 in Iran? And there are, of course, immigrants everywhere in the world. How can we raise awareness? Because I feel sad when the name is not mentioned. And I will be everywhere to just mention the name so we get used to that. They have been suffering for many, many years. They have had, I hope, Mahmood, that they are, at least one is mentioned in this 150. I really hope so.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Is there any comments to the question?
How to create awareness. I think you are doing an excellent job in creating awareness, and you should continue doing that. Say their names, and I hope that more people will do that. I'm glad that you could focus on Baha'i, and I hope, the more focused and concrete you are, the better. So not only say they are Baha'i, but they are also individuals, and they have names, and we should do that, all of us.
Thank you. We have time for one very short question. Anyone? Mahmood, can you just say, can you mention some of the challenges, some of the critical things that came out of the report that you didn't mention in your intervention?
Well, I think that, our aim with the report is to give a face to, when we read that they were workers' rights or lawyers, or you see who they are, what's their name, where do they live, a very short summary of, what has happened to them. We want people, as you now mentioned, Mahvash, we want the international community, but also civil society, basically anyone who sees this report, remembers at least one name and uses that name in somewhere. So I think that's the main... for me, it is always, I've been working with human rights in the last, with Iran human rights in the last 17 years, and it's always, I would say, shocking, extremely sad when you both write and read this kind of reports. You never get used to it. That how is it possible that someone was doing her job and she's not among us anymore, or she was arrested, or she loses, or he loses his job just because of demanding what would be, or like journalists like yourself, right? I mean, we have journalists who just because of an interview are sitting and, you know, sentenced to so many years in prison. We should not get used to it, and I think it's, I get shocked and sad every time we write and read these reports, basically any of them.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the great panelists, for the passion and knowledge. And unfortunately, we're out of time, and thank you all for coming.
Thank you.